Well, hello and welcome everybody to this RMIT Open Research Seminar on Open Access and Transformative Agreements. I'm really delighted to welcome everybody here today. My name is Matt Duckham. I think if we move to the next slide, I work at RMIT. I'm a professor in geospatial sciences, but I'm also director for the Information and Systems Engineering Enabling Capability Platform. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But if we can begin in the usual way, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia, where many of us today are situated, probably all of us. I'm located here in Naarm in Melbourne on the unceded lands of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, and I'd like to respectfully acknowledge Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung ancestors and elders, past and present. And of course, particularly extend my respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are present here in the audience today. Well, just before we also get started, I'll mention a couple of notes of best practice. The event's going to be recorded and we'll actually hope to make this event available to view again later on, or for people who didn't manage to make it. And we're very much looking forward to a lively discussion. So please do add your questions in the question and answer section. And if you particularly want to address your question to one of the panelists, please just make sure that's clear in the questions. You can add, the name of the panelist you want to direct it to, and we'll really be interested, to have a lively discussion with you, the audience, as well. I'm really excited by this. It's Open Access Week, it's OA Week, as I'm sure most people here know. This seminar series is all organised by the RMIT ECP programme. This is the Enabling Capability programme, which is all around supporting, enabling growing research impact. And so open scholarship is really a key part of that. But in particular, I think now is a great time, not just because it's OA Week, but because open scholarship, I think, is really going through some very significant changes and innovations right now. I think every time I look, in the news, in Twitter, on LinkedIn, or various other, channels, there seems to be more new ideas that have grown up. And certainly I find it sometimes tricky to stay on top of new developments that are coming out all the time. So I'm really grateful to our expert panel who we've got with us here today, all of whom are leaders in their field and all of whom have a passion for open scholarship and open access, and really looking forward to learning more about these latest developments, and I expect getting a little bit of a glimpse into the future. So I'll just introduce each of the panelists before we really get into the discussion itself. First off, we've got Rachel Ankeny. So Rachel's professor in the School of Humanities at the University of Adelaide and also a visiting professor at University of Exeter in the UK. She's an interdisciplinary researcher with connections to biological sciences, food studies, bioethics, migration history, science policy, and really widely recognised as an interdisciplinary scholar who's got that track record of translating research into a way that the broader community can understand. She's an international partner on European Research Council grant on open science and diverse research environments, a co-investigator on the ARDC, the Australian Research Data Commons project on improving Indigenous research capabilities, and also editor-in-chief of scholarly journals like Studies in History and Philosophy of Science, and noting that that's also like an Elsevier publication. I think all of us work with commercial publishers as well as with open access publishers, and so yeah, noting that, and currently leading a working group in Adelaide and South Australia on publication strategies. So welcome, really lovely to have you here, Rachel. Next off, I've got Carl Huang. So Carl's a research fellow in the Faculty of Humanities at Curtin, and also a statistical analyst and data scientist with COKI, the Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative. And really that's, if you haven't already seen that, an amazing data-driven project that's combining trillions of data items with cloud computing to generate these really interesting insights to open access, diversity, inclusion, sort of scholarly communication. And Carl, your own research is connected with bibliometrics and identifying models and methods for analyzing differences and patterns and correlations in bibliometric variables and bibliometric data sources. And Carl has a background as a mathematical statistician and a track record of publications in probability and statistics and financial risk modeling. So that clearly feeds into your interest in statistical models and large data science, and how that can help map this open knowledge landscape. So really lovely to have you here, Carl. Welcome. And then the next two wonderful colleagues of mine here at RMIT, delighted to be joined by Professor Lisa Given, who's the director of the Social Change Enabling Capability Platform, so a colleague here in the ECPs at RMIT. She's also Professor of Information Sciences in both the School of Global and Urban and Social Studies and the School of Computing Technologies here at RMIT University. So that really speaks immediately very strongly to her interdisciplinary research in human behavior, and bringing that critical and social research lens to studies of technology use and user-focused design. Lisa's a former president of the Association for Information Science and Technology and has served on the ARC's College of Experts, numerous grants funded not just in Australia by the ARC, but also Canadian Institutes for Health Research and Canada's Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and lead author of a number of books in this area, including the fifth edition of Looking for Information and Qualitative Research, and the Sage Encyclopedia of Qualitative Research Methods. So welcome, Lisa. Great to have you here. And last but absolutely not least, Gary is Manager of Library Services Research here at RMIT, and has experience as a library leader, and dealing. I mentioned all the changes that are going on, so that's very much part, I think, Gary, of your portfolio is leading teams through change and redesigning the systems that we use for libraries for improvement and collaboration. Gary's leading a project on library support for open and fair NTROs, non-traditional research outputs, as part of the CAUL, the Council of Australian University Librarians, Advancing Open Scholarship Programme, and was part of a recent project here at RMIT University to develop our new institutional open scholarship policy. And so, his team supports the promotion of open research and read and publish agreements, which I think we'll talk a little bit more about. So welcome, Gary. Lovely to have you here.
Thanks, Matt. Happy to be here.
So I might start with you to kick off with a question to you, Gary, if that's okay, because we've talking about all sorts of aspects of open access here, and transformative agreements in the title. Can you tell us a little bit about, well, what are transformative agreements, and in particular, so why is Australia and CAUL pursuing them at the moment? Why are they such a hot topic right now?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. So transformative agreements are really about repurposing library subscriptions. So a transformative agreement sees a shift from a library or a group of libraries paying a publisher for a subscription to read journal content, to one where they subscribe to both read and have their researchers publish open access without paying article processing charges or APCs. These can be negotiated individually or more typically in our instance via a consortium, and ours is organised by the Council of Australian University Librarians, or CAUL. The transformative part comes from situating this within a change in business models underlying scholarly journal publishing from a subscription-based models to one where publishers are remunerated for open access publishing. So CAUL is the peak body for university libraries. Approximately half of the scholarly content provided by university libraries arises from large package deal agreements, and I think these emerged in the 1990s with publishers that CAUL have negotiated with. It involves publishers like Elsevier, Wiley, Springer Nature, Taylor and Francis, IEEE, Sage, and so on, who account for a large proportion of academic publishing. In some senses, Read and Publish is a further development of these large deals, although we also have Read and Publish agreement with CSIRO in particular, as an example of a smaller publisher. CAUL have a general commitment to open scholarship, and one of their main areas is their advancing open scholarship program. As far as journals go, they're looking to migrate subscriptions into open access agreements wherever they can. Read and Publish agreements allow a reining in of the costs of hybrid publishing on the individual author, and hybrid journals are those journals, subscription journals essentially, that allow open access for individual articles via those article processing charges. CAUL began negotiating in 2019 and now have 15 agreements in place. And the first large agreements with major publishers were this year. The deal is available on an opt-in basis to 39 universities in Australia and 8 in New Zealand, with institutions able to wrap open publishing rights into their existing subscriptions at no extra cost. My understanding is that all Australian and New Zealand universities has taken up this agreement. And just to kind of finish RMIT, for RMIT from 1st of Jan to 31st of August, there were 53 of our papers were submitted to Wiley, saving us something like $300,000, 57 to Springer, saving us something like $218,000, and there were also some waivers for Cambridge, which saved us about 8,000, to CSIRO, which saved us about 6,000.
Thank you. And if I can just explore that a little more, because it's a reallocation of funding that we're really talking about, aren't we? The universities are moving funding from one area to another. So those savings, what what does that look like for a university?
Well, as I say, it's a repurposing and a leveraging of the large amounts of money the university pays for subscriptions, essentially, to journals. So it concentrates on that money we paid to journals to try and increase the levels of open access publishing within the institution by leveraging those funds.
And and the term transformative, I'm often kind of intrigued. Do you have any kind of insight into how that sort of, what's the flavor of that term? It is about, transforming what we do already, or it's sort of more around transforming how we do research. What was the thinking behind that term?
Well, I mean, my take on it, others may have other views about this. My take on it is it's transformative of academic publishing, essentially. the movement from a model based on paywalls and subscriptions to one where I guess you facilitate researchers publishing in an open access way and allow the publishers to move their business models from that subscription focus to open access publishing. That's kind of the theory,
the
but
transformation.
we'll talk about all the other things on the way, I'm sure.
And any other panelists, anyone else wanted to come in on that first question around transformative agreements? If not, I might move on. Thanks, Gary, and move on to the next question, which I was going to put to you, Rachel, if that's okay. Really around kind of the, diving into a little bit more about these transformative agreements and what they mean, for researchers. Can you tell us a bit more about, what are some of these advantages, but also the, the disadvantages and pitfalls of transformative agreements, and maybe kind of over the, the short term, but also this is a long-term transformation, isn't it? So, but what are your views on those?
So, I mean, to begin, you have to remember transformative agreements are very diverse, and they take a range of different forms, right? And so I'll talk generally, but we might want to get into some of the specifics later. I think, the positives are that this is a start, at least it's a step. But if we're thinking about open access as the goal, along with all of the sort of sub points underneath that, the question for me in a way is whether, we're likely to get there. Plan S, which is one of the big drivers, particularly in the European setting, sets 2024 as sort of the deadline for an open access system. And it's not clear transformative agreements are going to get us there. But another good thing about transformative agreements is it does allow authors to retain copyright. It does sort of consolidate the left hand and the right hand, as we were saying earlier, the libraries with what was going out sort of the research budget. And clearly it makes research more broadly available, say to policymakers or people who don't have university access. Maybe most importantly, at least for universities that participate, it eliminates those double payments that we were talking about, so that in some way, you're paying to subscribe to the journal and then you're paying to publish. But I guess there's a range of concerns that I just want to outline. One of the main goals around open access, including Plan S, but other mandates on open access, is to really foster equity. And it's not clear that transformative agreements really gets us there. And in particular, transformative access is going to be really aimed at research-intensive institutions in fairly high SEO kind of locales. And in fact, it may have, unintended sting in the tail that those in developing countries or at non-research intensive universities or in places unlike Australia that have sort of a national mechanism, in fact, have more limited pathways for publishing. And we've seen critiques of this from Latin America and Africa in particular. Many people there say, well, yes, we're going to be able to read stuff, but we always, to a certain extent, could do that. We could get things interlibrary loan. The publishers had special deals. They could just ask the author for a copy. I respond to those authors all the time. The problem wasn't the reading. The problem was the publishing. And this actually makes that worse. And at the core of that is that author publication charges are still central. It's just the transformative agreements, the institution, is buying them in some way through the package that's part of the transformational agreement. So I think those are very real concerns for me. The second thing is that transformational agreements were supposed to allow more transparency. And then there's been, a number of studies that try to look at the contracts, look at what's on the website, what's publicly available, even what's available at the institutional level. And there's still not a lot of transparency around things like publication costs. And I think, for these to be truly transformational in that way, that would need to be improved quite significantly. A related point is that one of the goals here wasn't just open access, it was that costs would begin to be constrained, that there was this blowout that's been recognized for a couple decades in the academic publishing sector. And it's not clear that these kinds of transformational agreements, or even what they're leading to, will actually restrain costs. They're kind of just shifting it. Finally, I guess part of the constraining costs would be creating more competition, and it's not clear that's going to happen. I mean, part of this is, I think, treating it in a way as one size fits all, and people publish where they publish for a whole range of reasons, right? There's some concerns that, for example, early open access efforts will be squeezed because they're less prestigious than some of the big companies that are now jumping on transformational. And what happens to these sort of early open access efforts? Finally, will this actually give universities, libraries, and so on more leverage? We've seen the attempts to cut deals, and this has been most well established, say, in a number of different places in Europe, and the deals they've cut are actually quite diverse, and that alone sort of suggests that yes, maybe they do have leverage, but the devil's in the details, right? Lisa's used that expression in this space previously, and I think the jury's really still out when you look at some of the meta-analysis of the contracts and so on, whether transformation is actually transformative is another way to put it. So kind of in summary, in principle, you can't just jump overnight into a new system. That's very clear. The system's very complicated and very expensive. There are costs that need to be covered. I think sometimes there is a naivete that, we can just all go in our basement and publish a journal and it won't cost anything. But of course, there's a lot of resources that go into this from everyone who's involved, including the things that aren't paid, like reviewers in most systems, but also, the publishers who distribute, who market, provide infrastructure, so on and so on. But the problem is that, I think there's actually probably a lack of agreement on what the eventual goals are. And in some way, the transformative kinds of agreements are just moving the paywall to a different point. So for big universities, and in here in Australia through the call agreement, which we'll talk about, I think in some way, yeah, it is a step in the right direction. But it's not clear in the big ecosystem that it actually is going to be sufficient or necessarily allow the goals to be met, particularly around developing countries and more openness of scholarly publication taken as a whole.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, I think that frames it really well for me. That sort of equity and transparency, and then the leverage is all around this changing dynamic of where that sort of impetus and power sits in this kind of quite complex relationship. I was maybe going to follow up. Also, this perhaps relates a bit to what you were talking about, Gary, as well, with the read and publish agreements. Do we have a clear picture of what does lead a publishing company? What's, because certain companies, as you said, Gary, are getting involved in these read and publish agreements, and there's a process for involving more. What are the actual dynamics there in terms of what the publishing companies are looking for? Aside from obviously profits, they're companies, so that's quite natural. But what are the incentives for them to get involved? Is it some of this leverage that's kind of coming out, for example, from Europe? Yeah, Gary.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I just kind of following on from what was just said, the ideals that we associate with open access to accelerate, share, and enrich research are not always compatible with the business models of publishing companies. I think that's kind of a fair enough statement. And the rise of gold open access and hybrid open access in particular, I guess, has allowed a new revenue stream for some of those publishing companies. I saw something on the LSE Impact blog that said in 2020 that revenues from APCs represented something like $2 billion for these companies. So I mean, that's kind of the reality of academic publishing at the moment. But I think I mean, we have had 15 years of discussion and declarations, and still the majority of our scholarly outputs sit behind paywalls, essentially. And as was just said, transformative agreements at least allow a first step. They put copyright ownership on the agenda, and rights retention on the part of the academic authors. They put that on the agenda. They allow a single contract rather than ad hoc arrangements with individual authors. You know, the imperative for transparency, at least it's on the agenda. So the subscription models contained a lot of non-disclosure clauses in those contracts that were signed up. So again, at least they allow, they put that idea of transparency of these agreements on the agenda. They're not there. There are no guarantees in this space, given the business models of academic publishing, but I think these agreements are a reasonable first step.
Great, thank you. And I noticed we've already got a couple of questions coming in on the Q&A, so do please put your questions in there. We'll certainly come to them very soon. But next, I wanted to come to what this means, you know, for authors around open access publishing. And I was going to put this question to you, Lisa, if that's okay. So what are some of the issues that you see authors facing around open access publishing? And, you know, what are the alternative models? You know, transformative agreements is one of those models, but, you know, maybe if you wanted to touch on other ones as well.
Thanks, Matt. And yeah, fabulous flow on from what we've just heard. And there's been so much to kind of unpack from both what Gary and Rachel were saying. When I start to think about this from the academics perspective, for me, it kind of comes at a couple of different ends, both the collective around our disciplines and then also the individuals who are sitting in their offices trying to get papers out the door. I often start by saying to people, look, authors actually really care about being open. We do want to share our work. Part of scholarship is open sharing of our knowledge. That's a really critical piece. And I think for many people, the publishing industry is often at odds with that goal around sharing for us. So it does put academics in a really strange squeeze point, particularly in countries like Australia, where we have things like Excellence in Research Australia that kind of drives us towards certain publications, certain publishers in order to gain some prestige and in order to really map against that excellence measure. Whether the journals are measures of excellence is a different question. But what's interesting at a discipline level is that there are many associations, for example, that have for a very long time had open access journals themselves, or they've had subscription-based journals and often really required those in order to provide some money to the association to do other kinds of activities, sometimes providing scholarships for doctoral students, for example. So there are really mixed approaches across disciplines in those kinds of models of publishing and potential alternatives. I think one thing that's always been a real barrier, a real challenge to open is that no matter what platform you want to use, what mechanism you want to use, there's money involved, right? You've got to pay people to edit papers, you've got to pay to host a website. And even for some small associations, those costs are just really prohibitive. Many individuals now are actually starting to use a lot of technologies themselves. So people may have their own blogs. I see very regularly people posting on Twitter, for example, not just here's a link to my paper, but here's a summary. I think in the impact space, a lot of people are starting to use those approaches because for many of the people we want to reach outside of academe, reading a paper may not actually be helpful. It may be too esoteric. What they need is actually the translation of those outcomes for practice and for adoption in practice. So many people have a variety of approaches that they're testing out. when we think about transformative agreements in that more traditional space, I think one of the biggest challenges for authors right now is navigating the finances on this side. Maybe the second one, as Rachel alluded to, is just its awareness. This is a very fast-moving space, and yet many academics will have kind of a small set of journals that they regularly publish with. They may not even be aware of changes in those agreements and how that is going to impact their work. But what concerns me the most is that many of these seem to be built around assumptions of available funds. And as Rachel talked about, that shifting of the goalposts and moving the money pots around, many people often will say to me, you know, oh yes, but then the costs are removed. Well, the costs are not always removed. Often there will be charges that still land in the laps of the authors. And then people will say, oh, well, you can pay that out of your research grants. Now, this causes a great deal of grief for people, especially like myself, where much of the publishing that happens beyond the granting period. So even if I'm able to build some funding into the granting period, that often won't work for all publications arising from the work. Many of the open strategies we're talking about are really about journal publishing. Often universities won't have any comparable models for humanities monograph style publishing. And so it is that notion of the devil being in the details, which is the title of an article I wrote with a co-author, Sarah Polkinghorn. I think we popped it into the chat so people can have a look. But it's really this idea that authors also need to be engaged and be at the table. A lot of these agreements are being coordinated through libraries, through universities, but not always necessarily taking into account diversity in our disciplines and the various pain points, especially financially, for a lot of our junior researchers in particular. For many people I know, it's often a question of, I may have to get this paper published, I may have to pay this few $1,000s out of my own pocket. So even in my own discipline, for example, it's a subscription-based Wiley journal that is our preeminent journal. It currently is free to publish if you choose subscription option, and there's only a reduction in the OA fee provided by the transformative agreement, not one that covers all of the costs. In my discipline, that generally means that everyone picks the subscription option because it's free. What we're really concerned about now is the US government shift in policy, which may see a journal like that move to an APC so that nothing is free. And then you're choosing between a one size fee, which might be smaller for old subscription style, maybe a larger fee for OA, who knows what the mix will be. But at the end of the day, people may just stop publishing in that journal. But where do they go? The world may get smaller and smaller. And again, we're back to Rachel's questions around equity.
Yeah, really good points. And I think I've also observed that in some of the journals I know. You frame it very well, that there is this move to APCs, but author publishing charge models, but that's not necessarily optimal when the researchers are making those decisions. And what I wanted to pick up as well, I think the way you frame that, the underlying motivations of researchers to have their kind of knowledge shared and to have it read, that's often kind of exactly as you say, it's a kind of squeeze point, isn't it? It feels unusual and sort of somehow a little bit strange for researchers who are, really looking for people to be interested in their ideas, that there are these, barriers that exist.
Indeed, and they have real consequences for people's workload. As universities actually link workload to the quality of a journal, quote unquote, the quality based on tier rankings, based on international scoring, it can mean the difference. So a lot of people, especially early career researchers, have to choose between something that they value deeply and ensuring that they're actually getting credit that's required to move their career forward. And that is just, that's not a win-win situation by anyone's definition. It means that many people are making tough decisions, often having to publish in proprietary venues they wouldn't necessarily choose in order to maintain that career path.
Yeah. We've already got one or two questions coming in from the Q&A, and I was actually just going to take a moment to dive into that as well. I think, both Lisa and Rachel, you did reflect on the costs. It does cost money to do this publishing, but one of the unaccounted costs is often those costs of academics in reviewing and often editing journals. Do you see a way? Just the question in the Q&A there around, would it be fair to put a monetary value on that voluntary contribution by experts in the field? Do you see a way or any models that are sort of introducing both that side of the cost equation as well?
Well, there are some already that I can just quickly answer. One idea, I'm not sure how you do it, because I don't think, part of the problem is it's not really clear then the whole system would be sustainable. But there are journals, particularly in some of the sciences, where if you review, you get a coupon that goes towards your open access fee, right? And it does incentivize two things. It incentivizes going back to the journal to do a review, but also using that journal then for your own publications. That in some way does level the playing field because that's open to anyone, right? There are some even that incentivize turning in the review quicker, which I have mixed feelings about, but you get, more credits if you do it in a timely fashion or in a very timely fashion in some of the cases. So that's one way you could do it. I think, that at least then feels like it's a tit for tat, where you're publishing, you're reviewing. And I think, as editor of a journal, I can often see, got a lot of people who turn down every single review request, but they're very happy to publish with us. And that's, to me, not supporting your community, because a lot of these things are very community based, right? But that's one. I'm not sure if you modeled the whole system, it could survive on that.
Yeah, but you're right. That's a very clever idea. I like that sort of incentive compatibility that we do need, to have more reviewers and higher quality reviewers. It's often a real drain on, or a very hard decision for academics where to put that time, and experts where to put that time. But if like we could actually make that, using a coupon system, like you're saying, that sort of seems to be, potentially really working together. Anyone else on those questions? Lisa?
I think the other piece I would add there is that many people also feel that reviewing activities should be better recognized in our workload models. For many academics, doing a handful of quote free reviews a year is seen as part of academic citizenship. They're often very happy to do that to support publishing, because we need to publish, we want to publish. Once that becomes exploitative, once they see that, wait, someone's making a lot of money off of this free labor, that becomes much more challenging. So I think for many people, they feel that, the institution pays me, it's part of my job to do some of those reviews, but then that should be reflected in the workload model just to demonstrate that that's an important level of engagement. I think other people on the complete other end of the spectrum would argue that recognizing this and monetizing this only reinforces the for-profit model, and actually they would rather put their energies into large-scale disruption. Now, what does that look like? Who knows? Because again, everything does cost money, but imagine if the world's universities, the world's libraries got together and actually sort of took over from these publishers, started putting out different strategies around how we're going to manage knowledge as part of our own endeavor, and kind of cut the corporates out of the mix. Would that even be possible? But I think we're kind of at that crux point of change must come. We're just not sure what it's going to look like.
Brilliant, yeah, and I see several other questions also coming up in the chat. I was just going to, before we come back to those, I was going to move the discussion a little bit, to that international perspective, that you were already indicating there, Lisa. And what do we know about what's already happening both inside and outside Australia? So, Carl, maybe I could come to you. What is happening internationally in this space? How is open access evolving, not just in Australia, but Australia as one player in this giant international initiative and effort? And what, but in particular, is there evidence around the take-up and effectiveness of transformative agreements?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So regarding that question, so I have 3 slides to share with the audience that should come up soon. Yep. And so the first slide is on global open access levels. And we can clearly see a rapid increase of the proportion of open access output globally over the last decade. And that's going from something like 27% in 2011 to 49% in 2020. What is also very interesting is the increase in the second half of that decade is mostly driven by increasing publisher open access. So for those of you familiar with the terminology, that's similar to gold open access. And this may come down to various factors, including the growth of OA journals, open access journals, and also traditional journals moving towards open access models, and of course the transformative agreement potentially playing a role. But if we split that open access levels into different ways that the articles are made available, then we also notice that the level of open access provided by other platforms, and that thinking of that as green open access, seems to be stagnating, and that could be a concern, which we might discuss a little bit later. And then if we move on to the next slide, just quickly comparing some of the top performing countries in terms of open access in the last decade. Some of the smaller nations are clearly leading the way, such as Mali, and obviously we can't ignore the effort that's been put into those. But if we filter down to nations averaging more than 10,000 outputs per year, then Australia's closest neighbor, Indonesia, has the highest level of access. And this is followed by the likes of Brazil, the UK, and the Netherlands. And it's a very interesting set of nations because they represent a diverse pathway towards open access. For example, Indonesia with a high focus on local publishing, having a lot of local journals run by local researchers and universities. And then we also have Brazil, of course, continuing to expand under the Cielo project. On the other hand, we've got Netherlands, which is one of the early movers for transformative agreements. We can really see that potential effect taking off. In particular, in the most recent year, they have around 80% open access. Yeah. And now the next slide, I want to quickly just come back to Australia, have a look at what's happening in Australia in comparison to what's happened internationally. And just in terms of the total level of OA, we lag quite a bit behind the global leaders. However, there have been signals of increases over the last 10 years with both the routes of OA expanding. And of course, that's thanks to a lot of the hard work that's been put in by the open access advocates, librarians, researchers, and various groups. And I think we've always maintained an optimistic view that Australia can become a global leader in this space. And there are obvious reasons for that, and that includes things like majority of the Australian universities, if not all, already have open access structures such as institutional repositories. And there's increasing awareness of open access in Australia, and there's a lot of support by various bodies and groups. And of course, there has been a rapid increase of transformative agreement negotiated by CAL. So these all work in favor of Australia's rapid growth in OA. So it's a positive outlook, but still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, no, thanks. That and it really helps to see that data. I was just interested by your noting that Netherlands is one of those leaders and has kind of explicitly adopted this stance early on. From Australia's perspective, is there a sort of first mover advantage? Like if we were leading in this area, would that sort of set us up for the future well? Or maybe it's going to be dominated by Europe and the US, the big sort of financial push. So do you think we're better off sort of following rather than leading in this area?
Yeah, I think that's a hard question, Matt. So Netherlands has obviously benefited from, well, we think it's benefiting from the Transformative Agreement being early mover in that space, but it also has other infrastructures, and you can particularly see their green open access levels are also quite high. So it's very often difficult to split out the effects of gold open access and green open access completely. But Australia having those all of these things in place, I think positions us to have a very positive outlook. I'm not saying that I can't tell how fast we can move, but having those infrastructures and things already set up, it just gives us that potential advantage. But having said that, like I said, still a lot of work to be done, I think, to catch up with those global leaders.
Can I just say something on this point? I mean, I think this is where maybe being small but being unified presents us with some bargaining power, and that's kind of what we've seen to a certain extent with the call. And that's why the Netherlands, to a certain extent, is quite leading, because they're quite unified and they can put all their resources together. The other thing I think is that the US is going to go probably quite a different way in many different ways, because they're just going to have so many different institutions bargaining. And the way in which they think about publishing is very different than we do here, I think, in many ways. And that's a story for another day. But, they don't have research assessment like we do, but, we're more like New Zealand and parts of Europe and whatever else. So I think Australia has the potential to think about what matters to it and actually make a difference in this debate, I think, because we do have the unification that many places will never really be able to have.
Yeah, no, that's a really good, really interesting perspective, that balance there. Just looking at the chat, the quick Q&A, we've got some great questions coming through. A couple of them on APCs, on these page charges, and that relationship to the caps in transformative agreements. I was just going to open up to the group in general. There's one here that, as we're coming to the end of the year, how are those caps increased, and can they be increased? Are we exhausting our allocations under these transformative agreements? Maybe, I don't know if anybody, Gary, I'm looking a little bit at you because maybe you're closest to that, but anybody have any views on how those kind of caps change?
Well, I'll just say that Call's preference is to negotiate these without caps. But of course, that hasn't necessarily worked out in practice with the publishers, and we're about to reach the Springer cap in early November.
Right.
We're not likely to reach the Wiley cap, but we'd be. I think our preference is arrangements without these kind of caps, and I guess that goes to some of the disadvantages currently in practice for ABCs.
Yeah, perhaps there's this kind of maturity that hopefully the longer we go on, the less that there are, the caps become part of it. And another very interesting question there, around in-house skills and in-house platforms. So should this be something, acknowledging that it does require investment, it does require, funding to run these sorts of activities, actually publishing, but the technology is always moving on. Is it something that universities should be considering internally to, actually support high quality journals inside from, published within universities? Does anyone have a view on that?
Yeah, I think, Matt, I can speak a little bit on that. I think one of the slides that I've given, Matt, just the next slide, you put that up very quickly, actually speaks a little bit to that, because one of the work we've been doing at Koki is looking at asking the question of, does open access actually reaches the goals of providing access to more people in more places? Rather than just more people, we want also more people in more places, especially reaching, you know, those or researchers or users in traditionally where they have more challenges of accessing research. So we looked at gathering all articles and looking at the citations, and particularly looking in detail of the citing articles and their authorships and affiliations and so on, looking at diversity of that. And one of the interesting results, well, the main result we got is that open access does reach more people in more places compared to closed output. And if we dive that a little bit deeper, what comes up is that the green open access actually has a slight advantage over gold open access. And that's very interesting, because that speaks to institutional repositories, disciplinary repositories, having that extra reach of, you know, providing access to more people in more places, and therefore, you know, it speaks to the value of having institutional and disciplinary repositories. So it's important to have, we think, to have a diverse path to that access that's provided to users, rather than focusing on just one particular path.
Cool, that's great. Elisa.
Matt, yeah, can I weigh in on this? Because I think yes, absolutely, that point is critical, and we do have the research that demonstrates that. I think the challenge is that what we're often providing in repositories are papers that are still being published in the traditional journals, right? I'm not sure if the question that we received was maybe about creating additional journals, additional pathways that are managed by universities. If that's the case, I think the biggest challenge we have is really the international ranking schemes. There is no doubt that people, you know, universities get more credit for publishing in a smaller pool of journals that are considered high prestige, as well as, you know, high sci scholars, highly cited scholars, which again is a very small and particular pool of journals where you're going to get credit for that status. To me, if there was one change that we could make globally, it would be to completely deconstruct the ranking system, and either, you know, stop using the existing ones, start creating some new ones. We are seeing out of Europe an attempt to do that, and actually to embrace kind of open as the mechanism of how we value our universities. But it, you know, anytime those rankings come out, every university starts to spruik their scores. The media pick that up. It's its own machine, and that for me is why a lot of the solutions we talk about in some way are band-aid, because we're within this larger ecosystem that has a lot of other problems that we've got to attend to.
But can I defend? I mean, there's a reason to a certain extent. It is sort of a citation. I'm not going to defend the rankings, but it is obviously sort of its own machine in some way, but those journals are the ones that people read the most in their fields for the most part, right? We all know what they are, right?
Yep.
And I know a number of universities in Australia tried to have their own in-house, usually books, but nonetheless, some of them had journals, and nobody read them. I'm sorry, but certainly nobody outside Australia read them, and almost nobody outside of sort of the institution would have even known they existed. And that's because it does take money to do these things, right? And at least for me, I shouldn't say this loud. I don't worry so much about the rankings when I publish, but I look for who's going to read my stuff, right? And you can have some control over that by getting it out there and whatever else. But to a certain extent, you know, things get read because of where they are still, despite the fact that people can do a Google search, where they are matters to who reads it. And until that changes, you can demolish all the rankings you want. There's still this preference to read somewhere where more people are going to read, or publish where somebody's going to read it.
I absolutely agree. The main reason I bring up rankings is because I have seen universities that link, again, workload into rankings, into,
Sure.
that whole ecosystem. And I think especially for early career researchers who can't publish in all places, they're often really tightly being tied to these existing publishers because of the ranking scheme.
Yeah. And I think some of the questions also echo that. And I was struck that the EUA, the European University Association Open Science Agenda, there was a statistic in there that 75% of European universities do rely on journal impact factors to evaluate individual academic performance. So, I think it continues to be kind of a very hot topic. Acknowledging time, I just wanted to come to one last question. We've got some great questions in the Q&A, and I think what we'll also try and do is any we don't get to, I think hopefully we'll have an opportunity maybe to disseminate some answers after this event and attach them to the recording, which we'll certainly make available to everybody. I just wanted to pick on one last question that's around that sort of global perspective, because, and coming back to a point I think you made right at the beginning, Rachel, around equity and living in a globalized world. There's a question there about the increasing use of open access does presuppose that all countries value openness and knowledge in their research. Is that a too strong an assumption? Like, are there is in this world today where I think often expertise is sometimes in competition with other viewpoints. What are the dynamics there? Is it a fair assumption that countries globally do value this openness of knowledge, and does that play into these discussions around open access? Don't know if I can pick on you, Rachel, for that one, just because I've
Sure.
charmed with your equity.
I think it's less about countries valuing the open access than it is sort of disciplines and types of research and some things like that. I mean, there are clearly countries that, keep a close, and we can name them off the top of our head. But, there's been lots of other countries that were so, quote unquote, closed, historically, that were very open to scientists exchanging knowledge and information and so on. So I think you're not going to find, big countries saying, don't get the knowledge out there. But in certain subfields, things are kept much more close to home. And also there's always going to be the commercial industrial trade-off around commercial and confidence knowledge. And I think that presents a more, a bigger impediment than any particular national policy. What I was saying had to do more with countries that just don't have the capacity to be participating in these large scale agreements. They currently don't have these subscriptions. The publishers actually are providing, the big ones that people often demonize, are providing free subscriptions to a lot of those places. That's part of where our money goes. And so we need to recognize, when we shift the arrangement and the budget changes, part of that also has to be somehow making it more inclusive. And that's not just national, it's going to be regional universities in countries other than Australia where people don't see them as part of the ecosystem, right? Or, the United States comes to mind just because there's just so many universities, many of which are very, very different in terms of their funding and other things. And they're not going to have a call arrangement like we do.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And also that point you make about, when we make a change over here, it also can have impacts over there. I think, Carl, when you were talking about green OER, that actually sometimes that may be being affected by some of the other things that we're doing in other areas. So yeah, I think in this complex system, staying on top of those is tricky. But I've certainly found it incredibly informative today. I'm really grateful to all of the panelists here. Before we go, I also want to say a big thank you to the team behind the scenes, Anne Normanchion, who's been very carefully curating the Q&A and helping with that, and also Ryan and Michelle behind the scenes. Thank you all very much to the audience. We'll make this available and forward more information to everybody who is here today. But thank you in particular to all of the amazing speakers, Gary, Rachel, Lisa, and Carl. I really learned a huge amount. I'm very grateful for your time. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Matt, for being a great facilitator.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.